Good morning. It's good to see this good number. We have guests with us this morning. We're especially glad to see you and hope you'll stick around after services and let us get to know you a little bit better and that you'll come back and be with us at any time. Before we get into the lesson this morning, I do want to make a couple of little statements, announcements, I don't know. First of all, I mentioned it last week, but I want to say again how much I appreciate our elders this last weekend, or how we got the Bible seminar, and I mentioned last week, but I think it bears repeating, how blessed we are to have men that are not, there's a lot of elderships, unfortunately, that it's business meeting and boardrooms, but to have spiritual-minded men that are spiritual shepherds, that are concerned about the souls of this congregation is a great blessing. And we ought to be thankful for them. And a lot of elderships aren't willing to take and invest the time and the money, the expense to bring someone in that can share with us the things to build our faith that Denny did this past weekend. But our elders did, and I appreciate them very much. And I hope that you will let them know how much you appreciate that as well. I also want your help for a little bit. I've got 4 young men that are going to start, 2 in the back and 2 on the front. You can go ahead now, guys, and start passing out some cards as I'm planning ahead for next year of what we're going, some of the lessons that I'm going to be presenting next year. One of the series of lessons that I want to do is called You Asked For It. And basically, there's 2 questions on this card that I would ask you to fill out. The first one says, I've always wondered about. And in those blanks, I just want you to put something that you, as a Christian, something you've struggled with, something we do, something we teach, something we practice, that you've always wondered, why is it that way? Or why do we teach that? Or why don't we do this? Or whatever it might be. And one Sunday out of each month in 2017, Lord willing, I plan on going through one of these each month and talking about some things to help edify us as a congregation, to help us grow in the knowledge of God's Word. The second question says, I have a friend who asks about. And I would like for you to put some neighbor, some friend, a co-worker, family member that as you've studied the Bible with, as you've talked about church or religion or whatever it might be, something that they've always asked you about. Why is it that y'all don't use a piano? Why do you take the Lord's Supper every Sunday? Why is it that you immerse for baptism? Whatever it might be that you've dealt with. And one Sunday a month we're going to take and use those as our lessons. And I'm going to let you know ahead of time in the bulletin what those are. And hopefully we can use that particular set of lessons as a form of evangelism. I have a preacher friend down in Texas that did this very thing at his congregation. And he said those Sunday nights they had more visitors than they ever had before or since on Sunday nights, because the members of the congregation went to those neighbors and friends and co-workers and family members and said, you know how we've always talked about so-and-so? Well, our preacher this Sunday night is going to preach on that, and I wish you'd come to services with us and we can both learn about it. So if you can fill those out, you can put them in the question and answer box in the back. You can drop them off in the office. We'll let the young men put the extra cards here on the front row. If you happen to not get one, you can get one. And if you can get those back to me by maybe the end of the month or so, then I'd appreciate that, and that'll help me as I plan for next year. In the book of John, we've been studying that on Sunday mornings in our auditorium Bible class, and if you have not been coming to our auditorium Bible class or coming to Bible classes, then we certainly hope that you will. But as we study the book of John, there are lots of words that John uses as themes that we can trace through the book and develop some lessons and see some main ideas and points that he's trying to get us to. And one of them that we can is a word that's usually translated going or go or something of that effect. And it leads to the question that you see on the screen this morning. That's the title of our lesson. Where are you going? You know, whenever we decided that we were going to go to Denver, Colorado, we were, after living in Weakley County, my family for 6 generations and Melody's for 5 generations, we were pulling up our roots and we were moving to Denver, Colorado for full-time ministry. We had this question asked to us a whole lot. Where are you going? You're going where? Where did you say you were going to? Now, it's not that they'd never heard of Denver. It's not that they didn't know where Colorado was. It's not that they didn't understand what we were telling them when we told them we were going to Denver, Colorado. The reason why they asked this question is because they wanted to make sure that we had really thought about it. They wanted to make sure that we had spent some time thinking about where it was that we were heading our life, the direction that we were taking our family and our lives as we were moving to this far-off place in Denver. They want to make sure that we knew the direction that our lives were going to go in. And you know, that's an important question for us to consider, isn't it? We need to know. It's important to know where we're going. Now, if you look real close on this way too close of a picture of Gordon's eye, you'll notice a little bit of a purple spot underneath it. When we were living in Denver, one trip that we had made back home, we were staying with my parents, and I was in their living room. I was studying that morning. The boys were outside. They were playing. And Gordon comes running in the back door, and he's got his hand over his eye, and he's crying. And I run over to him. I said, "Gordon, what's wrong?" And he said, "Well, I hurt myself." And I said, "What did you do?" And he said, "Well, I was riding my bicycle, and I run over Granddaddy's truck." And I said, "Was he driving? Was he moving?" "No, it was just sitting there." And I said, "Son, how did you run over a truck that's just sitting there?" And he said, "Well, I was looking down to see how fast I was going. And the next thing I knew, I'd run over the truck." And he ended up with a black eye. You know, it's important for us to know the direction we're going, isn't it? When we're riding a bicycle in Granddaddy's driveway, it's important. But it's all the more important for us to understand as we live our lives to do some self-evaluation and to figure out where is it that we're going. What direction are we heading in? Where is the path that we're following? What is it leading to? I appreciate very much Micah reading our scripture for us. Micah, as a young Christian, is on fire, and he's doing all that he can, and I appreciate him and his good heart so much. I appreciate Philip leading the songs that he did this morning to kind of get us thinking along this line. And we're going to look at in the book of John for the next few minutes. I hope you get your outline out. We're going to talk about a lot of passages that we won't necessarily have time to turn to, but I hope you'll write them down and go back and study them later on. And as we look in John, at least there are 3 different directions that we see that we can be going, that we want to consider for the next few moments. First of all, are you going home? Are you going home? If you look over in John chapter 7, that's the idea that we see in John chapter 7. Are you going home? In other words, are you giving up? Are you I'm going to throw in the towel? Are you having the mentality of, I'm just going to hit the showers? You know, things haven't turned out the way that I thought they would. Things haven't been the way that I hoped they would be. You know, my idea, my image, my conclusions that I'd come up with ahead of time, you know, life's not that way, and so I'm just giving up. Are you going home? We see that in the book of John. There's this big discussion in chapter 7 of the book of John about who Jesus is. And you have 2 categories of people. You've got people who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and you've got people who do not believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And they're having this big discussion back and forth. And some are saying, well, He must be the Messiah because He's done these signs. And no one could do these signs unless He was the Messiah. And then you've got these other guys saying, yeah, but we know where the Messiah is coming from, and He's not from there. He actually was, but they just didn't really know where He was from. And then the other guys are saying, yeah, but this, and yeah, but that. And they're having this huge argument back and forth of all the reasons why that Jesus must be or must not be the Messiah between those who believed He was and those who did not believe He was. And if you look down in John chapter 7, in verse 53, at the end of this big discussion, it says, everyone went to their home. Everyone went home. Where were they going? Everyone was going home. Now, it's interesting to me that it doesn't say those who did not believe in Jesus went home, but the ones who did kept following Him. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that the ones who didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah went home, but the rest of them kept trying to convince people that He was the Messiah. It doesn't say that. It says every one of them were going home. And so whether they believed that Jesus was the Messiah or they did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, the believers were no better off in this instance than those who did not believe, were they? Now, I'm not sure why that. The text doesn't say why it is that those who believed formerly that He was the Messiah, why they went home. Maybe it was that they were tired of arguing. Maybe it was that they decided that it wasn't worth the hassle. Maybe they had allowed themselves to be influenced by the arguments of those who did not believe Jesus was the Messiah, but for whatever reason, they went home. You know, it's interesting that oftentimes we go to the wrong sources to get our religious information, don't we? Sometimes we go to the wrong places to get what it is that we need to get about God. You know, there were in chapter 11 and verse 46, there were those who went to the Pharisees to find out what it was that they should believe about Jesus. And in John chapter 18 and verse 29, Pilate goes to the people to ask them what they think about Jesus. And then after talking with Jesus and admitting that he found no fault for him, a few verses down in about verse 38, he goes back to the Pharisees, to the Jewish leaders, and asks them what they think about Jesus. In John, we have a lot of people going to the wrong sources about Jesus. And we do that sometimes. Much like Naaman. You remember when Naaman, that great military leader, was diagnosed, he had this leprosy, and he was diagnosed by his little Israelite maid girl of what he needed to get over this leprosy. If you could just go back and you could talk to the man of God, the prophet of God, he would tell you what you needed to do. And so when he found out that he needed to go to the prophet of God, where did Naaman go? To the king of Israel. You remember that? And the king of Israel says, "What do you want me to do about it? I can't cure leprosy. You've come to the wrong source." And sometimes we do that as well. So, too many people are going to the pastor, to the priest, to their parents, when they need to go to the Prince of Peace if we want to find about Jesus. Sometimes we're going home because we give up. We're just giving up. In John chapter 20 and verse 10, even those 12 that were closest to Jesus, now 11 of them in John 20 verse 10, the disciples, it says, went away to their own homes. This is after Jesus had been put to death on the cross. This was after He'd been put in the tomb. This is after they had come to the tomb and found it empty. And they were giving up. Jesus is dead. The Messiah has been killed, and now someone has stolen His body even. There's no even physical hard evidence that Jesus was even here. What are we going to do now? Well, I don't know about you, but I'm going home. No sense in staying around here. They tucked their tails and went home. Where are you going? When things don't turn out the way you think they're going to in life, when your Christian life is not all a bed of roses like you thought it might have been, when our image of what Jesus is and is not is changed, when it gets tough to be a Christian, are you going to give up and just go home? Where are you going this morning? Secondly, if you look in the book of John, you see that sometimes we can be going fishing. That's what happened with Peter. You know, Peter was the bold one, wasn't he? He was the one that stood up when Jesus is saying, "Who do people say that I am?" Peter's the one that boldly stood up and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." It was Peter that was the one that on that Mount of Transfiguration said, "Let's build 3 tabernacles, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. It's good that we're here." It was Peter that said, "Lord, it don't matter if everybody else denies you, even if it means me being put to death, I'll never deny you." It was Peter that when they came to the garden to arrest Jesus, he's the one that drew a sword ready to stand up and go to battle defending Jesus. Peter was the bold one, wasn't he? But Peter was also the one that denied Jesus. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And in truth, we're sometimes a little bit unfair to Peter because even though we remember Peter for denying Jesus, guess where all the other disciples were besides John? They had run off and left Him too, see? But why we remember Peter denying Jesus is because his bold proclamations make his disappointments and actions so much more memorable, right? Because he was the bold one. You know, the best thing about Peter really was seen in his passion. We see that in Acts chapter 2 when he stands up to that crowd and says, "This same Jesus whom you crucified, God hath made both Lord and Christ." Whenever he stands up to the council and says, "You decide who we ought to serve, whether God or man." When it was he that was the one that was proclaiming the gospel to the Gentiles first in the house of Cornelius. It was Peter's passion that was his best attribute. But it was also his greatest weakness when he allowed his passion to control him rather than allowing himself to control his passion. He had denied Jesus. When Jesus needed Him most, Peter had denied Jesus, and now he was upset. He denied Him 3 times. He was confused. Why did we follow Jesus all this way for Him to allow Himself to be taken prisoner and be put to death? He had been embarrassed because after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, now he had seen, wait a minute, it's not really over. Jesus came out of the grave. There's a bigger plan here going on than even I could have imagined. I messed up big time. And after seeing the risen Jesus, he realized what he had failed to see. And he realized just how wrong that he had been. And so in John chapter 21, it says that Peter says, "I'm going fishing. I'm going fishing." And some of the others that were there with him, notice what they said. They said, "We're going too." See, Peter had an influence on people, and he's had that influence on these. Now they're wanting to go fishing with him. And nothing wrong with going fishing in and of itself. By the way, I like to go fishing, right? But for Peter, it's more than just a hobby. For Peter, this is going back to his former life. Remember, that's what he was when he started following Jesus. You know, I'm not too good at this being a disciple thing. I'm not too good at being an apostle. I'm not too good at this following Jesus. I've proven that I didn't do a very good job at any of those things. But I tell you one thing I can do, I can fish. That's all I've ever done. I know how to fish. I may not know how to be an apostle or a preacher, but I know how to fish. That's all my family's ever done. Our whole family business was around fishing. I'm going to go back to what's comfortable for me, to what's easier for me, to what I would rather be doing. I'm going fishing. And sometimes, isn't that what we do? Where are you going this morning? It's become hard to be a Christian. It's become difficult to be a godly parent. It's difficult to be a godly husband or wife. It puts us sometimes under pressure having to make a decision between what God says and what the world says, the business world says, our boss says, our customers say, our friends and family might tell us. Are we going to just give up? Are we going to go back to what's comfortable and easy? We've been placed with some sort of challenge in front of us to teach a class or to lead singing or to be involved in a one-on-one Bible study or to be involved in some benevolent work. And you know, I'm not real comfortable doing that, so I'm going to go do what's comfortable for me. Are you going fishing this morning? That's sometimes the way we do and take the easy way out, isn't it? Where are you going? We could be going home or we could be going fishing. But number 3, we could be following. Are you going to follow? Turn over to John chapter 18. In John chapter 18, we notice John. Now, John, in the book of John, does not call himself John. He calls him the other disciple. He calls himself the one whom Jesus loved, or that disciple whom Jesus loved, or the other disciple, or something of that nature. But in his humility, he never allows himself to be called by his name in his gospel. But that's who we're seeing here in John chapter 18 and verse 16. We're seeing that John followed Jesus. He followed Him in verse 16 during His trial. All the while they're bringing Jesus to further steps through the night of being beaten and being a mockery of a trial, all the laws that they're breaking to get Him on that cross, and all the while John is right there following Him. He follows Him all the way to the cross when Jesus looks down, and it's John that's the one disciple that He sees. You jump over to chapter 21 and verse 20, after His resurrection, when they're walking along that beach, it's John that when they look back is still following Jesus no matter what. John followed Jesus all the way to the cross and then kept on following Him all his life. In John chapter 1, at the end of that chapter, in verses 37 through 43, we find out that they all started off following Jesus, right? Lots of people wanted to follow Jesus to begin with. Some of them followed for the wrong reasons. We see that in chapter 6 and in chapter 12 and in chapter 18. Some followed Jesus because of what He could give them. He can feed us. He can be the one that's going to be the mighty military leader like David that's going to throw out the Romans and lead us to national prominence. He's the one that can make the blind to see or make the lame to walk or heal whatever sicknesses and problem that I have. He's the one that is the prophet like Moses that can bring bread out of heaven and take care of all of our needs. We don't have to work and worry about food anymore. Some followed for what they could get out of Him. And it's true, Jesus even Himself in John chapter 8 and in John chapter 10, and especially in John chapter 12, tells us about some of the things that we get from following Him. We get the light that He is. We get the shepherd, the good shepherd He is. And if we're following the good shepherd, then we have protection and we have go out into the pasture to receive the things that we need. There's things to be gained by following Jesus. But if we're just following Him for what we can get out of Him, guess what we're going to do when times get hard? Like everybody else in John chapter 7, we're just going to go home and take the easy way out. When things don't turn out the way that I want it to be, and when it's tough for me, and I don't know whether it's worth the struggle like Peter, we're going to go fishing and go back to what's comfortable. See, the reason to follow Him is because we love Him and we believe Him. You know, there's some that Jesus just flat out said in John chapter 8 and verse 21, just said that they couldn't follow Him because their hearts weren't right. Some of them couldn't follow Him because they said they didn't know where He was going. We talked about in class this morning here in the auditorium how many times Jesus told them, "This is where I'm going," even those who were the closest to Him. In John chapter 4, Thomas says, speaking for the rest of the disciples, "Really, Lord, we don't know where You're going, and how can we know the way?" And all the while, Jesus had been telling them, "I'm going to my Father. I'm going home. I'm going to heaven." And we say, well, if that's where He's going, then yes, I want to go to heaven. But that's not the question, is it? The question is, where are you going? Not where do you want to go? Because we all want to go to heaven, right? The question is not where do you want to go. The question is, where are you going? Are you going home? Are you going fishing? Are you going to follow? That's what Jesus says we have to do. So there, at the end of the book, as Jesus is walking along that shore with Peter, and as John is following along behind them, Jesus is telling Peter that that's what I need you to do. Do you love me, Peter? You know I love you, Lord. Then I've got something for you to do. And that's the question that He's asking us this morning. Do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these promotions? Do you love me more than these material possessions? Do you love me more than that social standing? Do you love me more than that hobby? Do you love me more than that friend or family member? Do you love me more than yourself? He says, then follow me. That's what we're supposed to do. In chapter 21 and verse 19, He says, that's what I want you to do, Peter. Even if it means you're dying on my behalf. Notice what He says at the end of verse 19 of chapter 21. He says, follow me. And Peter gets distracted. He looks back and he sees John and he says, well, what about him? What's he got to do? And Jesus says, don't worry about him. Don't worry about anybody else. You worry about you. Verse 22. You follow me. He tells us, put those things behind you and keep on following me. Where are you going this morning? There's really just two choices. Two choices of where we can go. First of all, we can do like Judas did in chapter 13 and verse 30. He's there with the light, capital L, of the world. And he turns his back on the light of the world and he goes away from Him. He goes out into the world. He goes into darkness. John chapter 13 and verse 30. This morning, that's a decision that you can make. You can turn your back on the light of the world. You can turn your back on Jesus, and you can go into darkness, into the world. The second choice that we have is that we can go to Jesus. We can go to darkness or we can go to Jesus. And if we go to Jesus, if we go to the cross and we see the love of God, and then we go to the tomb and we see the power of God, then we're going to make the same decision that Jesus' own disciples made in the passage that Micah read for us so well earlier in John chapter 6 and verse 68. Where could I go but to the Lord? This morning, are you going home? Are you going fishing? Are you going to follow Jesus? Because you believe Him, because you want to serve Him, you can confess your faith before this number. You can be immersed in water to have your sins washed away. You can begin walking in the light as He is in the light. Maybe you've done that, but as a child of God, you've been too easily giving up and going home. You've been too easily going back to what's comfortable, to your former life. And you know that it's time to repent of those things, ask Him to forgive you, and begin walking in the light, following Him again. Where could you go but to the Lord? If you need to follow Jesus this morning, come while we stand and while we sing.